pals, I'm here today to talk about 4 epic / high fantasy books I have picked up recently. So in January I did a TBR video, which I'll link above, which featured 12 fantasy books that I wanted to try and read this year. I've historically had quite bad luck with fantasy in that I don't enjoy a lot of books I pick up that I hear other people raving about, but the ones I have enjoyed, I've absolutely loved, and I get so much joy out of reading them, so I really want to try and find more fantasy that works for me. And I've been making my way through these at quite a pace. I thought this TBR would sort of last the whole year, but I'm actually hoping to finish reading all these by July and maybe make another TBR. So I've already reviewed 4 of them and I'll link that video above, and I'm now going to talk about the next 4. Now what I did last time is I spoke about them in order of sort of least to most favourite, which I think is going to be pretty difficult to do in this video because I'm 100% certain which one is my favourite, but of the other 3 I feel pretty much around the same place for different reasons, and that's because 2 of them I DNF'd and 1 of them I sort of wish I'd DNF'd, so it's hard to rank them against one another. So what I'm going to do instead is just talk about those first 3 in no particular order and then save my favourite till the end. So one I don't have is the Jasmine Child by Tasha Suri. I borrowed it from the library and I've since returned it, and it's a pretty long book, I think maybe around 600 pages. I've read this author's first book, which I can't remember the name of, which was a duology, and I didn't love it, and I felt like I perhaps could have DNF'd that one, but I felt like she had enough going on in her writing that I'd be intrigued to see what she did with her sort of next book, so I decided to pick this one up. And the premise of this, as described on the back of the book, is that we are following a maidservant who gets involved with caring for, I think she's classed as like a princess or like the emperor's sister. I can't remember what her like royal title is, but the emperor wanted her to like be burned as a sacrifice, and she refused, so he has sent her to sort of be imprisoned in this ancient temple. And this maidservant lives right by the temple, and so she is sent as one of the other maidservants to care for this, I think she's a princess. And as the story unfolds, you realise that this maidservant is the survivor of what were called the temple children. So quite a few years before, there were these temple children who were raised in this sort of mystical temple, and they had a sort of magical ability which was linked to nature, in that they can like move the earth, they can make plants grow, they can sort of be pretty both destructive and like create, so they can choose to destroy or like produce beautiful things, right? And somebody who'd been in charge at the time was worried that because they were part of a colonised land, he was worried that these children would allow these colonised people to sort of rise up against their oppressors, and so he directed for all of the temple children to be killed, and she was snuck out, and she's like a sole survivor of that. She has to keep it secret because of that. So in the blurb you're told that it's this magical maidservant who's like one of the oppressed people caring for this princess who's part of the family of oppressors, and they start to fall in love. My issues with this book are that actually there's lots of other characters, which I don't really hear other people talk about in their reviews. There's lots of other characters who you get chapters from. Everybody reads pretty much the same, like it's hard to distinguish whose perspective you're reading from. I also felt that both of the main points of view were fairly flat. Like, I feel like there's a really big thing in contemporary fantasy to have characters who are like really like do bad things or are inherently like evil, but you're supposed to like understand why they do these things, but it's like a really big deal that they're like bad people. And I just felt like we were told a lot that these women were bad without them really being bad, because actually I felt like their lives sort of entirely like made sense as to how they were. So yeah, I thought that was a bit heavy-handed in terms of the discussion of them being bad. I think the idea of this sort of coloniser and colonised person having this interaction together is really interesting, but actually this whole book to me felt like a prologue, because once you get to the end, without spoiling anything, you're set up for like a really epic next book. But to the point where it felt like I've just read over 600 pages of setup, and actually it wasn't very good setup. Like, all the characters are pretty flat. I didn't believe in their romance at all. Like, I was well up for there being like a lesbian love affair in this book, and I didn't believe it in the slightest. It just felt like it came out of nowhere. So yeah, this was a massive disappointment to me. I thought this had such potential. She can write really beautifully in terms of the description, but I think maybe she just has a problem with her world building. I think isn't particularly strong. It feels a little bit flat and messy, and I also think her character work could really do with some work. So I definitely won't be carrying on with this series, and I gave that one 2 stars. And then the next one actually had a fairly similar premise, and that is the Unbroken by C.L. Clarke. This one is around 500 pages, and I read around 250, I think, before I DNF'd it. And yeah, so the similar premise in this is that we are following Touraine, who is a soldier. She was stolen as a child. Her people were colonised, and the colonisers stole children, robbed them of their language and their given name, renamed them with these coloniser names, and trained them as soldiers. And she's in her early 20s, and for the first time in her life, her and the other people around her who were taken to be child soldiers are being taken back to their homelands, but to assist in the oppression of their people. And so the book opens with them arriving, and with Touraine stopping an attempt on the princess's life, who's called Luca. And the princess is in line, princess or soon to be empress, I again can't remember the terminology here. She's in line to be the next ruler, but her uncle wants her to like prove herself by quelling this rebellion in this colonised land. And Touraine saves her life and basically becomes the princess's sort of secretary, I guess, but the princess decides to use Touraine as somebody to send in to talk to the people starting this rebellion and to try and bargain with them. And again, I thought this could have some really interesting discussions about the idea of, you know, oppressed people being raised by their oppressors, them feeling like they owe something to the people who oppress them, and also Touraine thinks very little of the people she was taken from, so I thought that could be a really interesting discussion. But Touraine seems to just make silly decisions without much forethought, just to sort of make the plot have more going on. Yeah, like Touraine in the first chapter is like having this big disagreement with a friend about the fact that he's saying, you know, like, fuck our oppressors, like I'm not going to oppress our own people, and she's like completely disagreeing. But then at a certain point she continues to disagree with him, and then in other chapters when it's convenient she suddenly like wants to rebel, and it doesn't really make sense when she is one or the other. And again, I found their romance more believable. It felt more like lust than anything, but it did still feel a little bit shoehorned into the narrative, and so yeah, gave up on this one, which was a shame. And then these next two were both recommended by Chris over at Chris's Bookish Cauldron. We have quite similar reading tastes, but Chris reads a lot more fantasy than me, so I really trust his recommendations because I think we both look for sort of really beautifully descriptive writing and also really well developed characters in our fantasy. So I had a real mixed bag of responses because this first one I DNF'd and the next one I gave 5 stars. So the first one is The One Kingdom, which is book 1 in the Swan's War series, which has 5 books I think, and that's by Sean Russell. And I think this book came out in like early 2000 and it's around 700 pages, and I read I think 230 of those pages. The premise of this is these 3 young men who are cousins are travelling to just have a little adventure because they're from quite a secluded region, and they think before we settle down we want to see a bit more of the world. They meet this man at their fireside one night and he asks if he can share their fire and camp with them, and they're like, yeah, no worries. And then during the night they're all set upon by a band of very well trained and heavily armed men who are trying to kill the man who is sharing the fireside with them. They see him be killed and they manage to escape, and they sort of continue to be pursued by these men. They don't really know why they're being pursued. Now, one thing I didn't really get about this, and this is in the first couple of chapters, I feel like if you were them, you probably would decide to head back home because they're from a region which is notoriously difficult to get to and to attack. But instead they decide to carry on, and they join up with this man who is like from a group of people who always travel, and he is a storyteller and he collects stories from all over the region. And they agree to take him to this location. Now, one thing I found difficult about this book is that it doesn't have a map, and it's a book that desperately needs a map because this region sounds quite complicated and they're travelling through it. So just trying to picture it is quite hard. I looked online to see if there was a map, like maybe on the author's website, and I couldn't find one anywhere. So I found that a little bit difficult, but you can't really blame the author for that. So what I liked about this book, it is beautifully written. The author really describes the landscape, beautiful nature writing. You know, you hear what the wind sounds like in the trees and what the ripples on the water look like. It's beautiful. And I like the pacing. I like slow-paced fantasy book with lots of dialogue, which this has. My issue of this is that the three lads you're following are flat as fuck. They have no personality. They all inhabit these sort of archetypes. One of them is sort of a bit mean-spirited and like the Joker. The other is like the sort of strong and silent type. And then the one you're being told the narrative from, I don't even know, he doesn't even have like a tropey archetype. He literally has no personality. And I guess that's because you're supposed to like just read him as like a conduit for you to hear the story through, but I'm not a fan of that. And then this man who's travelling with them is basically just the info dumper. Now, I can put up with a lot of info dumping in fantasy because I really love world building, and I don't mind if you're told it in an info dumpy way, but this was a bit ridiculous. Like, there was just streams of dialogue where the storyteller was just telling us loads of history of this land. And I just got to the point where I'd read so many pages of them just travelling down this river, then making camp, more of the same, and just not caring at all about these men. Like, couldn't have cared less if all of them were killed. That I thought, I just don't think I can go on. And there are, I think, 3 other viewpoint characters, 2 of which are women, and I much preferred all of those 3 viewpoints. They had way more interesting stuff going on in their storyline, and I know at some point they're clearly all going to come together, but I just don't know if I'm willing to put up with those really flat characters to get to the rest. So this is one that, like, more than the other 2, I am a bit sad about DNFing because I felt like it had the potential, other than those flat characters, for me to really enjoy it. So I might have to look into, like, if they continue to be sort of the main characters in the rest of the books, and also what other series he's written, because maybe I could enjoy other books by this author. But yeah, just couldn't bear reading about these like really basic lads anymore. And a lot of people in the reviews said that they were really reminiscent of 3 characters in the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, but obviously I haven't read those books, so I can't comment on that. So there was that. But the one that Chris also recommended that I absolutely adored, and actually I think the previous one was Swan's War as a trilogy, and this is the 5-book series, which I'm incredibly happy about because I loved it. And that is Rules of Ascension by David Biko. This is the first book in the Winds of the Foreland series. This is around 650 pages. It's covered in cat fluff, and it was published, I think, again in the early 2002, and this has 2 maps, so already getting points from me. This is going to be quite difficult to explain. I feel like my videos about fantasy books are always much longer because you have to explain quite a lot of plot, so I hope this isn't too annoying. The premise of this is that there's this region we're following where there are 5 countries, and we are following one of those countries, and within that country there are, I think, 5 or 6 families. And the rules of Ascension within these families is that if the king dies without a son, it does not, the sort of monarchy does not pass on to, for example, his brother or his nephew. It will pass on to the next oldest man in the subsequent family, and there's like a ranking of these family. Now the book opens with a few chapters where you just jump years and see these catastrophic things happen to a couple of these prominent families, which sort of wipe out the people who could take the crown, right? And then you sort of get to the third or fourth chapter and you actually settle down to sort of follow the story. You're following this from quite a few different perspectives, and a really big element of this story is that this other race of people, of which one of them you can see depicted on the cover, who have a really short lifespan and are physically quite weak, but hold a lot of magic. And there's all different types of magical abilities they can have, but most of them only hold one or two. So like an example is some of them can control the wind, or they can create fire, or they can talk to animals, or they can read minds, like all these different things they can do. And that race of people tried to enter this area where all the humans were and tried to repress them, but they failed. And so now there's very few of these people left. They're called the Kirsi, I think that's how you say it. And they've somehow managed over the years to become advisors for all the ruling families, right? So they hold really high positions in terms of their political clout, but they're also really disrespected by the population at large. But in the sort of opening to this book, you get the sense that maybe these Kirsi are sort of pulling the strings of some of these people in the line of the rule of Ascension to be killed. And perhaps that's because they have another plan to, you know, take over this region. And it is excellent. This is very heavy on the male characters, is one thing I'm going to say, which is something I don't always love, but I was willing to forgive it because there were a couple of female characters who I really enjoyed reading about. There's a Kirsi who I really liked following, and there were characters in this there's a main Kirsi guy you follow who I really like and didn't want anything to happen to. And yeah, there are a lot of characters, so this isn't a fantasy book you read and like fall in love with loads of people, because you're following lots of people and you're sort of, it's a bird's eye view of all this political manoeuvring and how all these people are being affected, and you're sort of dancing around this region to different castles and stuff and seeing what's going on. But I just loved it. I think I do a really bad job of explaining fantasy books I loved, but the political like mapping of this world was excellent. The idea of the people who wielded the magic being like this disrespected race, but yet holding quite a lot of political power, is fascinating. And this is an example of where you can do the like bad characters really well, right? Because there are a lot of people in this book that do awful things for like the greater good, and you as the reader sort of agree with the greater good, because like as a reader you think, oh, like these Kirsi were really wrong for trying to like invade this area and like oppress these people, but also now I feel really bad for them that like they're being oppressed and they're treated as like second-class citizens, so I sort of sympathise with their motivations. But yeah, so it's really hard to consider who you think is wrong or right, and I really enjoyed that about this book. And as soon as I finished this, I desperately wanted to read the next one, but I've given myself a rule that I'm not letting myself read the next book in any of these series before I've read all 12, because I think I'd be like unfairly reviewing them, because I'd be basing my enjoyment on like more than one book. So I can't pick the next book up until I've finished all 12 of the books. I probably won't get to it till July. I cannot wait, absolutely loved it, and from that point on I'm hoping to just like binge read the next 4 because it was excellent. I thought it was great, so would definitely recommend. So do please let me know if you've read any of those 4 books and if you enjoyed them, like what your thoughts on them were, and also of course feel free to recommend me other books to pick up fantasy wise. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!